England, a land fought for and controlled by Celts, Romans, Angles and Danes, is renowned for its wild and beautiful countryside, and there are many ways in which one may see it. Some cycle or drive. Others float along some of the hundreds of miles of the old canal systems. One might even take a train. But there is only one way in which to make the coast to coast, and that is by walking the 192 miles that stretch across the north of England from St. Bees on the Irish Sea in the west to Robin Hood's Bay on the North Sea to the east. In 1973, Alfred Wainwright, a fell walker, guidebook author and illustrator, completed and mapped this walk across 3 national parks, over the mountains and valleys in the Lake District, through the Yorkshire Dales, and finally crossing the North Yorkshire Moors. He named this journey the Coast to Coast Walk. After a few days' rest in Kirkby Stephen, we're ready to start the second half of Wainwright's popular Coast to Coast Walk. This will lead us through more of England's North Country, the fells, deep valleys and rivers of the Yorkshire Dales, the Cleveland Hills and the North Yorkshire Moors. Every inch of the way will be steeped in history, every village, every church and building with its own story to tell. Many of the walking paths along this second segment of our journey crisscross themselves. The Cleveland Way, the Pennine Way, the Dales Way and the Lyke Wake Walk. I invite you to join us atop the crooked spine of the Pennine Hills at 9 Standards Rig, before a trek through the Dales to reach the heather-covered North Yorkshire Moors. After that will be the end of our walk at Robin Hood's Bay. This trek, which is becoming more popular every year, has been described as one of the finest walks in the world, through charming old English villages with quaint pubs and tea rooms, ancient abbeys, Neolithic monuments and medieval ruins. And we invite you to tag along for this second half of our journey as we cross the River Eden at Frank's Bridge in Kirkby Stephen in Cumbria, northwest England, heading for Robin Hood's Bay on the North Sea in Yorkshire. Kirkby Stephen to Keld is a 14.5-mile walk. As we make the steep climb from Kirkby, we are ascending the Pennines, the chain of hills which form the watershed that divides Yorkshire from Lancashire and the Lake District. We pass the small, quiet, charming village of Hartley, and its tranquillity is soon forgotten as we pass the huge quarry on the nearby fellside. Now, with Kirkby situated far behind us in the valley, the landscape sweeps green before us. The quarry, with its noise and heavy lorries, is soon forgotten. 2,172 feet above sea level and atop the Pennine Range are the most panoramic views to be seen on the whole of the Coast to Coast Walk. Of the Lakeland skyline and Eden Valley, across Swaledale eastwards towards the Yorkshire Moors. And on top of the crest stands the 9 Standards Rig. The purpose of these rocky cairns is uncertain. Possibly they once marked the boundary between Westmoreland and Swaledale, or were they constructed by the Romans to give the appearance of troops seen from a distance? This collection of cairns give extra interest to a summit with magnificent vistas. But whatever their purpose, on a day such as this, it was hard not to stop and rest and to admire their curious construction before entering the Yorkshire Dales National Park and the headwaters of the peat-brown-dyed River Swale. From this vantage point, we stand virtually on the border between Cumbria and North Yorkshire. Glorious! What a feeling! This is by far the most striking landmark that we have come across. This line of dry stone cairns varies in height from 2 to 4 metres. They extend in a line some 75 metres long. Some are round, one is pyramidal, and another stepped, with the northernmost one square. They are sturdily built, but they have to be, for on this pinnacle they catch the worst of weather. Sun and wind and heat and cold take their toll. When descending from the summit, the terrain is pathless and rough, and can be very boggy when wet. This vast upland of peat watershed is environmentally fragile, and it has suffered severe erosion with a constant foot-pounding of walkers. Just down the slope are trail markers. The blue route is the suggested way to go from August to November, while the green route is the optimum path to take between December and April. But the most popular, the red-marked route, is used from May to July. Regardless of your route and the season of travel, all 3 pathways converge at Ravenseat. On this day, the ground is dry and the sky is clear, leaving us worry-free about being lost in the fog, about being swallowed up in the bogs, or having to backtrack through the worst of the swamps. The cart track was easy to follow towards Keld as we walked the steep slope down and past Ravenseat. Keld is an ancient settlement where nothing much has changed in centuries, and which was named by Viking invaders. Its name means a place by the river. It is the halfway point of the coast-to-coast walk, the 100 miles point, and the first village that we met in Swaledale. Butt House is a lovely place to stay. The dinner was delightful, and it has good beer on tap. The walking distance from Keld to Reeth is an up and down hill trek of 12.5 miles, if one takes the high-level route through the old industrial mining ruins. However, we took the low-level route through the Swaledale Valley, which is only 11.5 miles. This beautiful stroll, one of the prettiest of the whole trip, allows one the time to fully appreciate the landscape. Well prepared for all weather, we have donned our rain gear as it began drizzling well before breakfast had been served. However, we cannot complain. The weather is warm, we have had clear, sunny days in the lakeland, and, according to Wainwright, there's no such thing as bad weather, only unsuitable clothing. And he's right. Swaledale's steep valley with enclosed meadows and fellside fields is one of the wilder and narrower in the Yorkshire Dales, and its unpredictable nature and tendency to flash flood has led to many tragedies over the centuries. In early Roman days, this area was left to the native population, as it was regarded as too wild to control, until lead was later discovered. The high route takes the walker high upon the crest overlooking Gunnerside Gill and abandoned mining sites. After one last look at Keld, we follow the deep valley route and the River Swale. There is a wide track along the very quiet, peaceful gorge. Remnants of intense mining from decades ago scar the landscape, though now it is a place of deep quietness and tranquility. Even considering the rainy day, this glacier-formed valley is one of the loveliest places to stroll through. Along the way is the village of Gunnerside. Its welcoming pub is a perfect place to dry out before we enter pasture lands of spring buttercups in blossom that stretch as far as the eye can see. Then we pass through a number of awkwardly narrow stone stiles, the villages of Blades, Kearton and Helaw, and a 3.5-mile hike on a concrete footpath. I'd rather trade that hard underfoot for even the muddiest of paths. And no, that is not Moses coming down the mountainside to deliver the 10 Commandments to the waiting Israelites. As we make our way to Reeth, the sound of the River Swale is always close by. It's an easy stroll, apart from the bit on the road, as we amble along the walking paths that have been built on top of the ancient stone walls. The long rolling hills are a reminder that the Yorkshire Dales region has been dubbed England's last wilderness, and for centuries loved by artists and poets. With the mines now closed, tourism has given this remote village of Reeth a new lease on life. It has the feel of the archetypical Yorkshire Dales village, with a weekly market still held on the spacious open green. Reeth remains a quaint little town, far off the beaten path for motorists and a delight for coast-to-coast walkers. Reeth to Richmond is an easy 12.5-mile stroll up and down the rolling hills past Marske and through Marwick. After crossing over the meandering Swale at Grinton Bridge, we leave the roadway, passing through pasture land, through stone stiles, 13 at least, in and out of kissing gates and alongside dry stone walls. These walls are just a fraction of the 125,000 miles of dry stone walls in this country, one of the most striking features of England's landscape. It is a scenic delight with the meandering River Swale and wooded valleys. While walking through the virtually uninhabited river valley, I couldn't help but think of the Swaledale Squeeze, a convivial weekend concertina-playing festival that was scheduled for the same week at Grinton Lodge that we had just passed by to the south of us. In climbing the 337 nunnery steps, I could not help but give thought to what it was like when the priory was still in full operation and the nuns took their exercise upon these steps. Footpath signs are so much more commonly seen outside the lakeland, and junction signs such as these are always a comfort, knowing that we have not lost our way. The pathways can be muddy through the heavily forested Whitecliff Wood, but atop this rise the trail is dry, though not easy to follow. It's a pleasant, gentle walk. This Swaledale region offers landscapes of such a variety that it makes one's heart soar. It's so much more than just old stone bridges, hills and dales, gates and stiles, and vast stretches of farmlands. It's a land shaped by glaciers 10,000 years ago, revealing grey limestone crags and great gills looking down on lush green sweeping valleys, interlaced with stone walls and dotted with stone barns on the valley floors. It's a place where copses of thickly grown trees stretch up to another boggy rise. It's a region that sets the pulses dancing for those who revel in solitude. There are few places in this world that are more beautiful. It's impossible not to stop and stare. Then, unexpectedly, from a slight rise in the roadway, is the first view of terracotta and slate roofs, and a sign indicating that we are 76.5 miles from Robin Hood's Bay to the east, and 113.5 miles from St. Bees to the west. It felt good to sit on a bench and take in the view before we began the long descent into the old streets of Richmond. We felt that this was a great milestone in our journey, and we chose this ancient walled market town for a 3-day rest stop. It was surprising to discover that the town is still centred around the castle, built in the 11th century. We could not have found more elegant accommodations nor a warmer reception than we got at Willan's house on Frenchgate, an ancient street only 2 minutes' walk from the centre of Richmond. The whole town of Richmond has an atmosphere of antiquity, and branching from the cobbled stoned market are numerous winding alleys known as wynds, with street names well preserved. The dramatically situated castle towers over the town, poised on the cliff overlooking the River Swale as it meanders along uncaringly, as it has done for thousands of years. It began as a trickle, growing from infancy in the high moors of the upper valley near Keld, to flow through the city of York to join the River Ure. The handsome castle keep and boundary wall remain virtually intact, but sadly the interior buildings have crumbled. We stood where kings had stood hundreds of years ago, with a view certainly fit for a king, overlooking the town below and the castle at our feet. It is a wonderful sight, and the blend of Richmond's old and the new stand apart. Historical Richmond is perhaps famous for the song, "Sweet Lass of Richmond Hill." On Richmond Hill there lives a lass, more bright than May-day morn, whose charms all other maids surpass, a rose without a thorn. This lass so neat, with smiles so sweet, has won my right good will. I'd crowns resign to call thee mine, sweet lass of Richmond Hill. With barely a hill to sweat over on this day's walk, we leave Richmond for Danby Wiske. Some walkers prefer to get this stretch of uneventful countryside out of their way by extending their walk to the 23 miles that would take them to Ingleby Cross. Because of the flat countryside, the 23 miles walk is readily achievable, but we have chosen to do this in 2 parts, with an easy hike of 14 miles and an early arrival in Danby Wiske. The River Swale is to our left as we leave Richmond, leading us on our way past the military training area and racecourse at Catterick. All was quiet as we passed through the woods, through a gate and onto the tarmac road at the tiny, beautiful village of Colburn, which was little more than 5 houses and a dog. After leaving the farm track, this was one rare day when we saw other walkers going our way. The Yorkshire Dales are prime walking country and truly appreciated by all hiking enthusiasts, for each dale has a character of its own. Hardy sheep graze the uplands. Stone-built farms and villages dot the landscape. And flowing along the valley bottoms are many rivers like the Wharfe and Swale. The fertile agricultural land seemingly stretches forever. Then, before long, the sounds from the traffic on the A1 highway, the ancient Great North Road, reminded us that many others were in a much bigger hurry than us to travel across England. We were approaching a maze of roadways at Catterick Bridge. We crossed right under the busy road and were happy to leave the noise behind and continue our easterly progress. From Ellerton Hill is an 8-mile walk on the roadway, the longest continuous stretch of road in the entire journey and the hardest on our feet. Gone are the dry stone walls in exchange for lush green hedges that block the view of the fields. We are still pounding pavement when we reach the signpost, 4 miles to Danby Wiske, and the coast-to-coast sign. Danby Wisk, at only 110 feet above sea level, is the lowest elevation on the walk. After a 3-hour slog on tarmac, our feet feel as if it is the lowest point in our lives too. Just before crossing Danby Wisk, Wisk, by the way, is the old Norse word for river, we arrive at Ashfield House, ready to soak our aching feet. Happily, having split this section into two, we face a mere 9 miles jaunt to Ingleby Cross and to leave the River Swale for good. In the distance and through the mist are the Cleveland Hills and the enormous Vale of Mowbray. When leaving Danby Wisk, we are almost immediately on the overhead crossing over the rail track. With the numerous transitions here from on and off the tarmac roads, we keep a keen eye out for coast-to-coast signs to reassure us that we have taken the correct pathway. As lovers of long rolling hills, pastures filled with sheep, and a quiet that is only obtained in solitude, we, like Wainwright, found this section of the trip to be a bit tedious, and it is the least interesting part of our journey. Rain from the previous days had left the track wet and slippery with many puddles. One would think that it would be less wet to walk through the tall grass, but that's not always so. When making this trek, it is ultimately important to know the right-of-way terms and conditions. A right-of-way is defined and established by usage as a pathway over another's land. Then there are public roads, private roads, and common ground. It is only on common ground that one can wander at will. So, when one is in doubt as to land usage, do ask. Don't just clamber over the nearest gate in hopes that you're on the right track. An overcast sky led to a day of showers and high winds. On top of the challenges of nature, one has exceedingly tall stiles to cross, and a double-tracked railway to scuttle across in fear. Ever looming in the distance are the Cleveland Hills, promising more exciting and more strenuous hikes. Another high point in our walk will be our arrival at Ingleby Cross, for there we enter the third of the national parks, the heather-clad, wild and barren North Yorkshire Moors. As we trek through this pastureland, it makes us wonder, if cows could talk, would they ask why so many crazy people choose to walk through their garden? After a morning of heavy grey skies, the weather suddenly changed from blustery wet to one of sunshine, as we find that it often does here towards midday. One could hardly resist taking a few moments to converse with some local residents, possibly hoping to pick up a few hints on dairy or sheep farming. Then we pause before we make a mad dash to the other side of the A19 dual highway, which we fail to show here as it was much too hazardous to film. The crossing of this very busy highway is probably the most dodgy point on the whole coast-to-coast walk. As I reached the other side, I stopped and counted our team. Yes, our numbers are still 4. The sign pointing us towards Ingleby Cross was hardly necessary. From Ingleby, we begin the climb up the slope to Park House. It could not have been better situated, for it's right on our pathway for tomorrow's walk. With its glorious views, menu, liquor bar, and elegance, it should be more accurately described as Park Resort. It was the perfect place to stay for the night.
At cock's crow we began our day. In leaving Park House for Claybank Top, or in our case Great Broughton, it is a 14-mile walk. Shortly after leaving Park House, the lofty ground of the high moors looms before us. We didn't bother stepping from our pathway after these many days of rain onto the boggy, off-route, unmarked trail that leads to Mount Grace Priory. Instead, we climbed the long slope, took the hairpin turn, and continued up to the crest of Beacon Hill. It was the perfect place to look back to where we had come, across the dangerous dual highway that we had scampered across like frightened rabbits towards the Vale of Mowbray, further beyond Ingleby Cross. Checking the map again, we are reminded of the 4, or is it 5, annoyingly steep climbs that we will face today. But since Wainwright hasn't failed us yet, we expect the views to be worth the challenge. After the large communications towers atop Scarthwood Moor, we joined the Cleveland Way. The moorland is an absolute wonder. We could have stood for hours taking in the view before descending the long stretch of paving stones laid to protect the heath. The heather and bilberry is in full bloom, and the colour of the fell is at its best. Reds, browns, and a multitude of different greens. From the backbone of this high plateau, one can see the Vale of Mowbray to the west, Teesside to the north, the Vale of Pickering towards the south, and ahead a vast expanse of high plateaus and deep valleys. We have arrived on the North Yorkshire Moors. It is here that we join the Lyke Wake Walk and the Cleveland Way with a virtually unspoiled panorama. We could see for 50 miles in every direction. This open country reminds one of the Pennines, but the colours here make it more inviting. The wilderness is filled with ancient tracks and few roadways. Nature has hidden the scars of extensive mining that once ravaged this countryside. The old stone-carved marker, simply etched with LWW, Lyke Wake Walk, marks this trail, also shared by coast-to-coasters, and will lead us all the way to the Lion Inn at Blakey. What an extraordinary day of trekking we are having through moors, woods, banks and greens, with names like Arncliffe Wood, Scarthwood Moor, Clane Wood, Hoothwaite Green, Live Moor, Carlton Moor, Kringle Moor, Kirkby Bank and Hasty Bank. For the first time in days, we come across a group of ramblers, and it was entertaining to see that they too, at times, struggled with the pathways. We pause to take in the view and draw in a few deep breaths before we begin our climb. And it's interesting that today we find the trail more occupied by walkers than on any other day. Rain sets in, as it often does atop the moors. The slope is long but gentle. As I manoeuvre the first hill, the easiest of them all, I console myself that what goes up must come back down. It was worth the climb for the well-deserved pause atop Carlton Moor. And I looked, as most coast-to-coasters do, to see if the North Sea was visible yet. I couldn't see it through the haze, but I didn't feel disappointed. Just knowing that it was getting nearer day by day was enough. Atop Carlton Moor are boundary stones and an ordnance column. What a view it is! But do hang on to your hat, because the wind is fierce. Leaning against the boundary marker to enjoy the splendid view, I cannot help but think of all the wind-driven sports, like gliding, that one could be doing up here. With the weather against us, we were glad that we had wisely prearranged with our hosts from Newland's house to pick us up at Claybank Top and to drive us into Great Broughton. Having arrived in plenty of time, we sat in drizzling rain, staring at the faint sight in the distance of the monument marking Captain Cook's birthplace, Marton Village, while we awaited our ride. One would never know that the 9 miles pathway to Blakey is shared by Lyke Wake Walk and Cleveland Way walkers, as we seemed to be the only ones out there. After the steady rise from Claybank Top to the broad upland expanse of Urham Moor, the highest elevation on the North Yorkshire Moors at 454 metres, the trail is virtually flat and an easy walk. The fertile soil supports abundant wildflowers. Even before leaving Great Broughton, we know that we are in for a drenching. On this wet and windy day, the downpour is relentless. The disused railway track snakes along the top of the moors, and, in fine weather, the views are indescribable, so people told us. I looked out, hoping for the great view down to Farndale, but weather did not permit such examination. Atop high Blakey Moor, we had our first sight of Blakey Inn, not to be arrived at for another hour as we plodded along the seemingly endless old disused railway track. The Welcome to Blakey sign is misleading, for it too was still far from Blakey Inn. The rain, as uncomfortable as it is, seemingly enhanced the colours of the landscape, and even in the downpouring of rain, one could not but stop and gaze. The landscape was peppered with inscribed boundary stones, some leaning with time and moss-covered. It is such a peaceful place, with simply the mournful cries of red grouse, golden plover, curlew, lapwing and meadow pipit drifting across the moors. Even in the rain there were birds everywhere. Wet and bedraggled, we arrive at the Lion Inn that dates from 1553. It sits perched upon the barren, lonely moor that drops sharply into the valley of Eskdale below. On a drizzling day such as this, none of the patrons were drawn to sit in the patio area. Therefore, the sheep took it upon themselves to mow the grass there. The ancient Lion Inn at Blakey is one of the nicest and the most comfortable that we stayed at. We were served the finest of food in the stone-walled restaurant, with a wine and beer list to suit all needs. But be aware that they do not have any clothes-drying facilities for soggy hikers. Blakey to Glaisdale is only 9 miles and is not the expected long, gradual slope that leads into Gromont as it appears in the guidebook. Instead, it's a series of noticeably furrowed ridges separated by deep valleys. It's an easy, interesting walk. Today we leave the Cleveland Way and the Lyke Wake Walk behind us, and a flat, open upland stretches far onto the horizon ahead. As we pass by a headed white pillar called Fat Betty to our left, I realise that it's another notable day, for today we cross the watershed into the Eskdale Valley, where the pastoral scenery sweeps far into the distance towards the ever nearer North Sea. With Fat Betty almost a mile behind, just as we approach the great Fryup Dale, is another opportunity to get a view of the North Sea. The rainy day leaves a haze on the horizon, preventing again the first view of our destination. Leaving the roadway at the bridleway sign is the solitary stone building called Trough House. This is a shooting box or rough country house built to provide accommodations for a shooting party during shooting season, and is open for weary travellers needing shelter from the weather. We didn't stop. Old coal pit mounds still mar the landscape, even though nature and a carpet of heather, bracken and rushes have done their best to hide the scars. Alfred Wainwright wrote, "Yorkshire's limestone country is a land full of surprises. Its charms are shyly hidden. Those who seek and find them are often enslaved. Yet few visitors come looking. The moors and the wild places remain quiet. The curlew cries and the lark sings, but there are very few wanderers afoot to hear their call." That, too, has changed with time and the increased popularity of the coast-to-coast walk. But if one takes a moment to pause, the curlew cries and the lark songs can still be heard. At Hart Leap, a mountain biking path intersects with ours, and a group of eager cyclists are challenged by the muddy, rough terrain, as one or two end up headfirst in a mud hole. We later meet up with another group of walkers going the other way, but they were not taking on our great adventure, for they were out only for the day. They were full of admiration when they heard how far we had come. At Glaisdale Rig, 3.5 miles from Glaisdale, the rain begins again. Following the old highway, the going is easy, though very wet. After a full day exposed to the elements, it felt good to see the signpost to Laneside B&B. We were ready to dry our gear and put up our feet. The mere 4.5 miles from Glaisdale to Gromont was in itself deceiving enough, but it was the 700-foot elevation climb up the hill beyond Gromont that will totally exhaust us. Although the weather has improved after too many days of rain, it's not to be an easy day. After checking and rechecking the map, it is obvious that we are unable to avoid the muddiest trail of our entire journey. There is no doubt that we must take the pathway alongside the River Esk, walk a full mile up and down slopes, overgrown in places, through slippery gumbo and waterholes of East Arncliffe Wood before rejoining the roadway that leads to Egton Bridge. Exhausted, we reached the top of a hill, and, just when we thought that we were through the worst of it, the path was again rutted from vehicle usage, and the puddles were deeper and harder to avoid. It leaves one wondering what type of vehicle would even approach such a bog. The hamlet of Egton Bridge is one of the prettiest towns on the coast-to-coast walk, and St Hedda's Church stands on the corner of the junction where we turn easterly and down the long incline to Gromont. The River Esk slides by past us on our right. Gone are the days when a toll is collected for using the road, though I suppose walkers would not have had to pay anyway. However, there was a time when toll was collected on horses and carriages, motor cars, motorcycles, lorries, buses, tractors, and even hearses, though, we understand, for the dead the fee was considerably less. Their last bargain, I suppose. Long before we arrived in Gromont, the whistle of the steam-driven locomotive could be heard. Having achieved our 175-mile milepost, we wanted to give ourselves a treat and jump aboard the old steam train that ran from Whitby to Goathland. But, as bad luck would have it, we just missed its departure and time wouldn't allow us to wait for the next one. Ah well, we'll have to wait to pay homage to Captain James Cook and to see Whitby another time. Up, 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 up. Up the 700-foot steep climb we go. This hill is called no other than Eskdale Side Cum Uggle Barnsby. Soot-stained cottages line the street on this, our last steep climb on the walk. The blackened buildings are just another blight left from the days of nearby ironstone smelting furnaces from 150 years ago. Boy, it feels good to reach the top, and I have no doubt that even the best of walkers struggle with this one. The moorland is before us once again. In only 2 more miles we will arrive at Intake Farm, a working farm and a B&B outside Littlebeck. Whitby and the North Sea can be seen in the distance, both a reminder that our destination is near. Then, ahead, the moorlands glowed red and green, giving the impression that they have been freshly painted for our arrival. We pause as we pass by High Quebec Farm and Low Quebec Farm. Since we are Canadians, it gave us that good homecoming feeling on this our last night before reaching Robin Hood's Bay. It feels odd in a way, knowing that in 11.5 miles and at the end of this day, we will have reached our journey's end. Leaving Intake Farm for Littlebeck, we make a hairpin turn and head back south. We were looking forward to a nice stroll through the picturesque Littlebeck Wood. Little did we know that after a long stretch of rainy days that we would be slipping and sliding, wading in puddles and hoping more than anything to remain upright. In good weather conditions, it would be a delight to amble alongside the stream as it babbles away in companionship with us. When one is more able to take their eyes from the path, there is also a chance to spot a deer or a fox. As I performed these, for me, athletic moves, I tried not to consider the bogs that we would also face later in the day, but instead thought about the fact that we would later be joining the Cleveland Way again and envisioned reaching the long-awaited cliff tops of the North Sea. Finally, at the crest of the hill, we came across an enormous, hollowed-out rock. It was an oddity amid woodlands that is virtually free of stones. It had been carved in 1790 and was mysteriously named the Hermitage. The only evidence of the artist's name are the initials GC above the door entrance. It was dark, damp and cool inside, and as I sat on the carved bench, I could not help but think aloud.
Amazing place. Can't imagine living in here, though.
This kind of strolling or traipsing across the north of England is more to my taste. I hear in the distance the sound of a waterfall. Savouring the moment, I paused and watched the endless flow. Not for one moment did we realise that we would later have to ford the larger stream that grew from it. 3 of our 4 made the crossing without difficulty. However, one of our team was not able to face the torrents. He retraced his steps through the muddy footpath, crossed the bridge and tripped through the forest on the other side. It was a great relief to see that he had not lost his way. Then, before we knew it, the forest thinned out, the track became wider, and we left the woodland behind. We were surprised to see more daywalkers. There had not been many on our whole journey, which was unexpected. To be honest, we had not seen many people at all along the whole of the coast-to-coast walk. After a short stretch on the tarmac, we crossed a stretch of marshland to avoid more roadways. Making our way towards the lone tree, it was hard to avoid not being up to the ankles in the soggy bog. Our last sighting of Whitby is in the distance. Then we are at the crossroads to Whitby, Scarborough and Robin Hood's Bay. It was only a mere 2.5 miles to our final destination by taking this shortcut. But after coming this far, it would have made us feel as though we were cheating to do that, so it was absolutely out of the question. We would walk towards the North Sea, a little further north, through the caravan park and back along the cliff path, just as Wainwright had done it. He probably didn't like the caravan park any more than we do, but by taking Wainwright's route, we were to have the best views of the final dramatic headlands, and, finally, as intended, we were finishing the walk the Wainwright way. Stumbling along the headland, with the North Sea crashing below, it was hard not to think of the legendary fell walker Wainwright again, the man who devised this walk, and his passion for walking, a passion that had consumed us all in this past 3 weeks. He was an extraordinary man with an extraordinary story. It was his reaching the highest pinnacles in the lakeland that tugged strongest at his heart. He devoted his time and energy to the fells, and single-handedly and single-mindedly wrote and sketched the hills and pathways of northern England. He wrote about the fells. Words are inadequate to express and explain the emotional impact the fells had on me. During the making of the books, they dominated my thoughts. They held me in chains. I was living a double life. On a day when I didn't have to wear a collar and a tie, I was a boy again. If I was heading for the hills and not the office, I could set forth singing, not audibly, heaven forbid, just in my heart. I was off to where the sheep were real, not human. He wasn't the sort of man who wanted to be filmed, famous or found. He just wanted to be a fell walker and most enjoyed being alone. Wainwright never drove a car, and his second wife Betty was quoted as saying, after a couple of sorties while he was doing the Pennine Way, "I had the temerity one day to ask if I could accompany him. He looked surprised, was silent for a few seconds, and then said that I could join him if I didn't talk." On one occasion, he was asked to appear in a documentary, but when the producer arrived at his home at Kendall Green, the pipe-smoking Wainwright said, unequivocally, "Right, youth, I think we'll treat this like a western. Get your cameraman on the roof, and he can film me walking out of the front door." This idea of his grew from his fondness for John Wayne movies. What a sense of accomplishment he must have felt when, in 1973, he finished the walk and was known to have said, "I have finished the Pennine Way with relief, and the coast to coast with regret." He didn't like the Pennine Way, but he was very happy with his coast-to-coast trek. Though I have not walked the Pennine Way, I feel in my heart that he could not have said it better. Walking through Robin Hood's Bay, with gulls screaming a raucous welcome and the sea crashing far below, I am reminded of that first day when I looked out over St. Bees on the Irish Sea. How tidy we were, how clean and neat we looked. Now, tourists pause to stare at our mud-stained boots, bedraggled clothes and staggering walk, not knowing about the great feat that we felt we had achieved. There is no celebration awaiting our arrival, but none is needed. We know in our hearts what we have done, and we stroll down the long slope to enjoy our celebratory dip of boots in the sea, sign the coast-to-coast walker's book in the Bay Hotel, and order up a pint of beer.
Well, here we are at Robin Hood's Bay. We've finally made it all the way from the Irish Sea in the west to the North Sea in the east. 18 days of quite tough going, but through the most beautiful countryside you could imagine. Much of it you couldn't even see if you weren't on foot. But we did finally make it. It hasn't been a walk in the park. It's very hard work. So if you do prepare to do it yourself, get fit.
It will feel different tonight, and sad in a way, when we lay our heads to rest at Strionhall B&B, knowing that we don't have to listen for the cocks crow in the morning. Instead, we can lie in bed, awaiting the aroma of breakfast cooking, watching the sun creeping into the room. We can take a satisfyingly deep breath before we roll over again for another 40 winks, for we have completed the 192 miles walk from coast to coast.
When we left the Stonehouse Farm B&B in St. Bees on the Irish Sea, we had no idea how magnificent this adventure would be. After miles and miles of stone walls, dozens of stiles and kissing gates, scaling mountains and meandering through delightful meadows and moors, we completed the 192 miles coast-to-coast walk from St. Bees to Robin Hood's Bay in 18 walking days. But we really did need and relish the 7 rest days that we took along the way. At times, though, it was very, very hard work. When sometimes we felt we had reached our limit, we'd suddenly crest another rise to take in views that were so magical that we were once again refreshed. We wouldn't trade this experience for any other. In fact, we'd welcome the opportunity to do it again, and we will, but in bits and pieces. We'll slowly and leisurely walk the hillsides. We'll climb to the highest pinnacles to savor those special moments, but we'll do it the Wainwright way, to take the time to stop and stare.